My name is Bob. I'm an alcoholic. Can we have a moment of silence? Followed by the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me this serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. I'm really nervous. I know that if I make the slightest mistake, I will be picked on. This is a real honor for me. In the first few years of my sobriety, I was running a lot. I'm not sure exactly what I was running from, but I was running a lot. And I would listen to AA tapes. And some of the tapes I got into were some of Clancy's tapes. And I really liked this guy. And I had this image. I had never seen a picture or never met him. And I had this image of some Burgess Meredith type character that would scowl and jump on people. And I've been told that that was kind of a true image. But I found that not to be entirely true. When we picked up Clancy at the airport, I was surprised at what a nice-looking man he was. One of the things that I got from his tapes was to focus on similarities. And that's one of the things that I learned early on in Alcoholics Anonymous, in my recovery. How much more alike we were, rather than how our case was different or how my case was different. It's really hard to introduce a man who's had such an impact on so many lives. I wouldn't even say he's touched a lot of lives. I think it would probably be more accurate to liken it to a sharp poke in the eye. But in Keith's talk yesterday, I think that was just about as eloquent an introduction as anyone could make. Clancy has touched lives, and I feel very honored and privileged to introduce him to you tonight, and I feel very honored and privileged to be in the same invisible boat with this man. Clancy.
Thank you.
I've never laid anybody with so much sobriety.
My name is Clancy I. I'm an alcoholic. I never violated confidence, but confidentially, she said, she just whispered in my ear, she had never laid anybody with that much sobriety. Perhaps I can tell you about the 14th step. Older folks know about that. You know what the 13th step is? The 14th step is when you're too old to do it, but they let you watch. I'm very glad to be here. I wish I didn't have to do what I'm just about to do because it's contentious and it's dumb, but I got to do it anyway. I'm an old fuddy-duddy. About 26 or 7 years ago in the San Fernando Valley, there was an old guy named Bill Davidson, or Bill D as he was known as, and he was kind of a curmudgeon, but he was a good old guy, and he had strong opinions. He felt, for example, anonymity. He felt strongly about anonymity, and he felt everyone should just be the same. No one should ever be above. No one should ever be known more than anybody else. I guess he figured just sit in a circle anonymously or something. But anyway, what he used to do when they'd read the traditions, they get to the end of the traditions, and from where you're sitting, you'd say, remember that. Principles before personalities, you'd say. They say, oh, for Christ's sake, Bill, dummy up. No, I'm not going to dummy up. It needs to be said. So this went on for a while, and after a while, 3 or 4 guys, one of them whom I knew, were mocking Bill. And they'd join in and say, principles before personalities. How about that, Bill? You know. And it went on like that for a while. Then apparently somebody came in and heard this and thought it was some sort of a spiritual breakthrough and took it back to their group. And for about 10 years, there was about 5 groups in the central San Fernando Valley where they said principles before personalities. Nobody ever knew why. And then somehow the bacilli got out of the bottle, and now it's spread to a lot of places. I'm sure the people who said it tonight are from Los Angeles. It's gotten, I mean, it really is getting ridiculous, where many times group secretaries are getting up and saying, please do not chant. This is not a game. This is our life. And the next time you chant this, I want you to know you're not being spiritual. You're just mocking Bill Davidson in the Canoga Park meeting. I just thought you ought to know that. And tonight they joined in on the end of chapter 5 for no reason whatsoever. But if it works on the traditions, it must work on the steps too. God could and would have sought. Yeah, I don't judge, I just report. And there's something else. Of course, I can't blame anyone for this. I wish I could tonight. But the guy who read chapter 5, for reasons of his own, did not put in the numbers, so people had to start shouting them. But there are some parts in AA where they think that's cute. Every time they read chapter 5, the whole crowd joins in and says 1, 2. And it just gets to be a joke, and everybody laughs and has a good time with it. And also, at the end, there's a group of motorcyclists in Flagstaff, Arizona. The first time I heard it, the only time they shut off their motorcycles and kept from revving their engines was when they get to that part of chapter 5 where they all hollered, what's the point? And they said, the point is that we're willing to grow. You know, ho, ho, ho. This is not some kind of a joke game procedure, folks. I don't know about your life, but my life depends on this. If I were in the church, which I'm not, if I were in church, I don't think my folks would join in and say 1 for the first commandment, 2, 3. What's the point? Just dummy up. Get active, and pretty soon you can participate. Let's see now, who else can I offend next? I want to, this goes against my grain also, but I want to commend Bob and Mary. They were excellent host and hostess. Don't applaud. I just said they're excellent hosts and hostesses. They just left me alone. But they really were pleasant. They met me at the airport. They were very kind, and the way hosts and hostesses should be. When I needed something, they were there, and when I didn't want anybody, they let me alone. And it really was great. I really enjoyed that. And I want to thank Ed, who invited me to talk here something over a year ago, and I couldn't come at his convention in last April because I was, of all things, making a speaking tour of the cities of South Africa. But he asked me again to come. He said, could I come this year? And so I'm very glad to be here. I'm glad to see a lot of old friends here, a lot of new friends, and glad to see people I've known over the years. And I know that you'll enjoy the speaker tomorrow morning, Jack. I have to be back to talk at a dinner tomorrow night, so I have to leave early in the morning. But I've ordered his tape, and I'm going to listen carefully. And if I find any errors of philosophy, I'm going to call him up and denounce him. He may have taught his wife to love him. He never taught me. I guess you'd have to be at the meeting today to understand that. I was reading the history of AA. I was reading the history of AA in Honolulu, or in Hawaii. It's kind of an interesting little pamphlet with a red cover during one of the dull talks. And it's interesting that I got drunk for the first time the day before my 16th birthday in Pearl Harbor. It had to be July 8th, 1943. And about that same time, AA came to Hawaii. Within a couple of weeks of that. So little did I know that I took that drink that, why, there are broken men in spirit and body who need help, who are finding love. And who cares? Get out of the way, you old fools. But it's an amazing thing. But this Alcoholics Anonymous, I guess I've been sober so long, I sound like an old fuddy-duddy, and I'm sure to young people, they'd see that way. Oh, I want to say one more thing. I had a wonderful trip yesterday to Hilo, and got a chance to go to Hilo, and where my oldest granddaughter was born, and had a chance. I got her some little souvenirs of her birthplace. She lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, now where they have a half-inch of rain every 2 years. So I let it rain on me for quite a while so I could bring it back to her. But I guess I know there's a number of new people here, and then people in their first few months of sobriety, the first couple of years of sobriety. And one thing that I never had when I was new, I don't want to get off to a little long harangue, but just as a kind of a thing, because we don't often get a chance to think it. It's so easy to take AA for granted. I took AA for granted when I first went to my first meeting. I took it as I slept for the next year after year after year. And without understanding the context of what Alcoholics Anonymous, what an unusual thing it is. You know, there are written records of people like you and me who have an unnatural reaction to alcohol. They didn't always call them alcoholics. They called them a lot of things. One time they used to put them to death. They thought the devil was possessed them. But for over 4,000 years, at least, there are written records of people like us. In every generation, there seems to be a small amount of people who get an unnatural reaction to alcohol. They don't know why, but they're getting it. And in all these years, people have tried to help these people. Sometimes they put them to death. They send them away. They do all sorts of things. But in all these years, over 4,000 years, there's only been two very brief periods where there's ever been any place like you and me to go to for help. And that means if there wasn't any place to go to, you didn't have a chance, or I didn't have a chance, if you be, as this book says, an alcoholic of our type. Now, you all know about one of those places because you're sitting in a meeting of it tonight in Hawaii. But you may not be conversant or very conversant with the other one. And that was in 1840. In the first half of the last century, for some reason nobody knows, it was the highest ranked incidence of drinking per capita in American history. And 6 guys got together in a bar in Baltimore, and they all were old drinkers. And they all had signed the pledge and failed, and they all had gone to doctors. They're priests that tried to help, and they all just were losers. And they were talking about how nobody really understood them. And one guy came up to the IDD and said, you know, you guys are the only guy who know how I feel. I got an idea. Why don't you try to help me stay sober, and I'll try to help you stay sober because I know how you feel. And they said, okay, we'll give it a shot, just for the hell of it. And they formed a little club, and they stayed sober. And they got some more people involved, and they stayed sober. And pretty soon they had a little chapter in Washington, and they were staying sober. And pretty soon they had a little chapter in Philadelphia, and they were staying sober. And pretty soon they had little chapters all over. At the end of the year, they had a number of little chapters. And by this time, they were staggered. You know, nobody had ever done anything like this before. Nobody ever tried to keep drunkards sober by having worked with other drunkards. So they were the first of a kind, so they thought they would be like the first thing in American history. So they named themselves after George Washington, because he was the first president. And they called themselves the Washingtonians. And they took his birthday as their anniversary. The actual anniversary was like February 15th, but they chose February 22nd. Okay. By the end of the second year, they were in most of the states of the United States. In fact, they sent out a letter in New York, or from New York, they sent a letter saying, why don't you get someone in your community who is not an alcoholic or a drunkard himself, but who can come and talk to us and get a better feeling of what we're trying to do? So all over the country on February 22nd, 1842, people came in and talked to the Washingtonians. Just in passing, it's kind of amusing. The speaker in Springfield, Illinois, was a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. And he gave a very interesting little talk, short. I have it on the wall of my office. You can find it in the book of Lincoln speeches. And he had no idea what made drunkards, but he had some kind of a sixth sense. He said, I just don't seem to have the thirst that you have. I'm sure if I had the thirst, I would be where you are sitting. But I don't have that thirst, so I do not feel superior to it. But I've noticed that those who have the thirst also combine it with a great deal of sensitivity and intelligence. And I don't know why. But I wish you well, and I hope you continue the wonderful work. Well, anyway, continue to grow. By 1845, it was everywhere. They estimated, the bottom estimate of the membership of the Washingtonians in 1845 was 500,000 sober alcoholics. Now, if that doesn't sound impressive to you, stop and think. AA, after 5 years, had a little over 1,000. And that was with all the modern communication devices and trains and planes and radios and phones. And then they did something in 1845 that seems quite understandable, because people try to do it today in AA. They'll do it in your group sooner or later. They do what seems to be intellectually correct, and there's nothing wrong with it. They got thinking, we've done such a wonderful job for so many people. Why shouldn't we use this great power and help people with other problems, with other kinds of problems? We could help narcotics addicts who are alcoholics. They didn't have narcotics like heroin and cocaine, but they had laudanum and opium. We could help, and they got helping. They had a big bunch of their members got involved in the temperance movement, prohibitionist movement, where they wanted to stamp out the sale of alcohol. They got very involved in that. Some of them got involved in the anti-slavery movement. Some of them got involved in politics at the governmental level, whether or not to take over Mexico, to fight Mexico in the Mexican War. Some of them got involved in whether or not we should try to absorb Texas. And everybody put all the power of all these wonderful people to work, and they just all did wonderfully. And by 1848, to all intents and purposes, the Washingtonians were extinct. And with very few exceptions, they all died drunk on the street. I have a book home written in 1862 by one of the few survivors. And he talks about he can't understand what happened. We were doing so well. We helped so many people. Nothing like this in the history of the world. And then all of a sudden the people just didn't seem to be around anymore. And they stopped coming. I don't know why. And now I don't know where they've all gone. I'll tell you how extinct they became. Jump ahead now, if you're kind of new, to the early 1940s. 40, 41, 42, 43, like we talked about. Alcoholics Anonymous was growing, had some members, a lot of places. They were coming apart. You can't imagine the problems AA was having. For example, Bill Wilson, who wrote this book, dictated in the office of a man named Hank P. to his secretary much of it, and she transcribed it. Hank P. was his right-hand man. Jack Trabob was his co-founder in Akron, but Hank P. was his right-hand man, the guy he leaned on. Hank P. suddenly got the understanding that Bill Wilson was trying to do a deep personal insult to him. And he got drunk. And he spent the next couple of years going to all the little meetings that he could reach on the East Coast and telling them that Bill Wilson was a liar and a cheat and a thief and no one should pay any attention to him. Talk about division. The people in Chicago hated the people in New York, so they only would communicate with the people in Akron. The people in Los Angeles wouldn't communicate with the people in Akron, they communicated with the people in New York. Everywhere there was the people in New York. Bill was in New York, Dr. Bob was in Akron, and they got along fine, but their followers hated each other. The people in Akron thought the people in New York were anti-spiritual, and the people in New York thought that people in Akron were just old Oxford types and Oxford group types and didn't understand AA, and just on and on. My favorite little incident, because it sounds so terrible, but it has a good explanation for it, guy in Florida. He was reported for selling memberships in AA. And they wrote him a severe letter and said, how dare you sell it? And he had an excellent answer. He said, it's my experience that at least around here, when people get something for nothing, they pay no attention to it. When they pay for it, they'll read it. And I don't keep the money. I send it to New York. I just want them to read it, which seems reasonable. But anyway, about 1943 or 1944, A guy in North Carolina sent Bill Wilson a letter and said, we're going to like the Washingtonians. We're going to become extinct. And this is the last chance we got. And Bill Wilson, to tell you how extinct they'd become, had never heard of the Washingtonians. The only thing that had ever worked for alcoholics in the history of the world. So we had to get some books. And he read up on the Washingtonians. And he thought about all the letters he was getting from all over the country of people and fights and bickering and difficulties and hatreds and people getting drunk right and left over these emotions and these resentments. And he didn't know what he could do about it, but he realized we were like the Washingtonians. And finally, in the mid-1940s, he put all this experience to work, and he sat down for some time. And he wrote the 12 Traditions as a reaction. A lot of people think the 12 Traditions were probably all just came with the book and the 12 steps. They didn't. The 12 Traditions came much later, and they weren't based on what should be. They were based on thousands and thousands of people getting drunk, doing it differently. Well, he introduced the 12 Traditions to the membership in the Grapevine in the late 1940s. I'm happy to say Alcoholics Anonymous has only had one drawback in its entire career. It is made up of alcoholics. And from all over the country, you got these scornful letters. We don't want no rules! We come here to find love and understanding. Goddamn rules! And really, a lot of difficulty with it. Nobody wanted to accept him. Some people wanted to accept him, but they thought they were fanatics. And so, things were going bad. So Bill and Dr. Bob got together, these two great friends, and decided if we could just get everybody together once. If we just get them together once, they'll see that we're all fighting on the same battle. Maybe we're not so different that we're not different. The people in Los Angeles aren't different from the people in Akron, from the people in Charlotte, North Carolina, from the people in Tallahassee. God, we've got to get them together somehow. So they assigned their followers, find us a place where we can meet and have a convention. Well, people in Akron said, we'll go to a convention, but we're not going to New York. And the people in New York, not to be outdone in maturity, said, we'll go to a convention. We won't go to Akron with them hayshakers. So Bill and Dr. Bob got together and made a Solomon-like decision. They said, Cleveland. All right. So they all went to Cleveland for the first International Convention of Alcoholics Anonymous, July 4th weekend, 1950. And that's a very interesting convention. I have the tapes home of that convention. What's fascinating. That's where Dr. Bob gave his last talk. It's been reprinted many times. You may have heard it on tape somewhere. It's because he was dying of cancer. He had to be helped to the podium by his son and by somebody else. And he held himself up and he tried to communicate everything he knew because he knew he wouldn't be around long. And he talked about the things like that Alcoholics Anonymous, let's leave the scientific things to the scientists. That's not our job. As Keith mentioned last night, Alcoholics Anonymous is just two things. It's love and service. We all know what love is. We all know what service is. We don't need definitions. And he said, let's never be too busy to stop and give the man behind us a hand, because none of us would be here if somebody hadn't done it for us. And he said, let's try to remember to guard that erring member, the tongue, which has caused more pain than almost anything in our viciousness toward one another. And it's really a touching thing. And they helped him to the podium after the end of his short talk. And a short time later, he died. Which, in passing, this has nothing to do with anything, but if you're new, you might as well understand who we're doing business with here. They decided, they had such a nice convention, they decided to do it every 5 years. So they had another one in 1955 in St. Louis. Then they had one in 1960 in Long Beach, California. And I was sober about a year and a half in Los Angeles. I didn't want to go to all, I knew there'd just be a whole bunch of winners and old-timers and pukes. But my sponsor made me go, so I went down to the Friday night meeting. And I didn't realize Bill Wilson told his story on Friday night. That had become the tradition. So Bill Wilson told a story. I'll tell you, I wish you could have been there. I had a very good seat. I'll tell you why. Things were not very well organized then. And there was a mob of us milling around outside the Long Beach football stadium. And some guy came out and said, we need some ushers. Everybody want to volunteer? And I didn't want to be out here with all these goofs. So I volunteered. All they did to be a usher, they put your purple armband on that said usher. And he said to us, now you people, when they come through the door, try to find handicapped people and old people. Get them to a good seat. Okay. So I snatched off the first old lady I saw come through. And I took her down to the front row and put her right on the corner, took off my badge and sat next to her. I may be sly, but I'm not stupid. So I sat there while Bill Wilson talked. And then he introduced his sponsor, Ebby, the only time he ever gave a speech at a convention. And he talked. And then he introduced Sister Ignatia. And then Lois. And then Father Ed Dowling. And then Sam Shoemaker. I'll tell you just, holy Christ. Now, it really got to me. I went down there with the old guy named Eddie Regan. And we went in the car and we cried. It turned me around. I got turned back shortly thereafter, but it turned me around. But anyway, Bill Wilson, told his story every Friday night. So 1965, we went to Toronto, heard Bill Wilson talk in the Toronto Maple Leaf big garden up there, hockey. 1970, we all went to Miami Beach to hear. I went in 1970. I was going to talk at that convention. I was so excited. I was going to talk on July 4th. But Bill Wilson was going to talk on Friday night. I was going to talk on Saturday noon. And 20,000 of us in this big auditorium. And here's Bill Wilson going to talk. And we're just excited. And a guy came out and he said, I have some very bad news. Bill is too sick to talk. We knew he had emphysema, but we didn't know how bad it was. But he couldn't breathe anymore. He said he cannot talk. And just heard 20,000 people go, oh. He said, but we do have a substitute. And he called up some poor boob. And with the typical alcoholic fairness, we resented him because Bill wasn't there. You better be good, son of a bitch. We punished him. Well, we were walking back to the hotel after the meeting, and I was talking to John McHugh, an old-timer that was sober in Philadelphia, or in Pittsburgh with Dr. Bob. And I said, isn't that too bad? We will never hear Bill Wilson talking. He said, kid, Bill Wilson will talk at this convention. He'll talk. I said, no, he won't, John. I talked to somebody from the World Service House. He's not going to talk. He can't talk. He'll talk. I said, I'll bet. Well, so I gave my little talk the next noon. That was exciting. That next night, we thought maybe Bill Wilson will talk. And he didn't. So the last big meeting is Sunday morning. If he doesn't talk now, we ain't going to hear anymore. And they introduced some other boob, and he got up and talked, and it wasn't Bill Wilson. And we all felt downcast. We worried about Bill. But about halfway through his talk, a guy came out, tugged on his sleeve. And the guy turned around and said, I got some wonderful news. An ambulance has just delivered Bill Wilson. He's behind that curtain in a wheelchair. Let's bring him out. And I'll tell you, we all stood up and clapped, and the organ played. And here comes this guy in the wheelchair, little tubes all over his nose and coming out, tanks, oxygen tanks, and just sends a shiver down your spine. And he must have sucked in some breath somewhere, because he was able to say 3 or 4 sentences before he ran out of air. He said, he said, we are very glad to be here, and this wonderful organization will continue as long as God wants us to do so, and we must do God's will. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the scene, he ran out of breath. He couldn't breathe. If you heard the tape, you heard his voice. It sounded like the tape is broken. I can't talk anymore. And I sat down and whipped him out to the ambulance, back to the hospital, and he died sometime after that. But I was walking back to the hotel with John McHugh that day. And I said, John, how in the hell did you know that he was going to talk? Nobody knew how he was going to talk. How did you find out? He says, kid, you got to remember, you're dealing with human beings. Some of them are inspired human beings, but they're human beings. He said, do you think Bill Wilson would want to said that Dr. Bob talked while he was dying and Bill wouldn't? And later on that convention, that same convention, they had 6 guys get up. Each of them took 2 traditions. And they each read 2 traditions and tried to explain it to the membership, to explain, these aren't really rules. We have no ways of enforcing them. We're just trying to tell you how people can stay sober, so it won't happen to us. Then at that convention, they begrudgingly accepted the 12 traditions. They were printed in the book, 1951, the next edition. Not in the short form. They weren't accepted. They were written in the long form. And I would suggest to you, if you find the traditions kind of dull and uninspired, from time to time, read the long form. They're in the back of the book, right across from the short form. And they are a long that tells you exactly what they mean. The short form is just kind of an abbreviation. In our group in Los Angeles, we read that long form once a month so that everybody understands what it's about. It isn't just, so often groups read the traditions as though it's just see if a newcomer can pronounce autonomous, Get Freddie to read them. I don't think he can pronounce anything. But these traditions are rather important. They were accepted. It is amazing. We have no way to enforce them. There's no enforcement procedures. And that's, it's the same thing as sponsorship. In my area, I'm sometimes known as a dictator-type sponsor. And I suppose I am, but I have to tell people. But it is impossible to be a dictator-type sponsor without the absolute approval of the dictatee. Because around here, all the guy has to say is, screw you, and the dictatorship is over. That's the end of that. I've always thought we should have AA police. They could come at night and say, did you say screw you to your sponsor? You'd better come with us. And it'd be nice if we had those for traditions. People break the traditions right and left and think they're being cute. People give anonymity. I'm helping AA by telling them I'm in AA. I don't know how many people I've seen over the years break their anonymity for their own gain, and none of them have ever profited from it. Nearly all of them eventually got drunk. And the ones that didn't get drunk lost the spark of AA. Something spiritual in there, isn't it? Anonymity is not to protect you from it's a matter of surrendering your ego. And there's all these traditions, that we think are just abstract rules. They're based to a great extent on the Washingtonian experience and the AA experience. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people like you and me have died from not having those things to follow. So make sure that you take care of them. It is my opinion that the 12 traditions are much more important than the 12 steps. If I don't work the 12 steps, I may get drunk and die. But if we don't have the 12 traditions, we're all going to get drunk and die. There's going to be no place to go. Because I'll tell you, your great-grandfather, if he was like you, no matter how sincere he was, there's no place to turn. The time has to come when you got to drink again. And we all know that feeling. And we think, well, AA is there. But can you imagine what it would be if AA wasn't there? There's no place to turn. Call up another doctor again and say, what's wrong with you? Call up a minister and say, why did you stop sinning? Call up your parents and they say, how could you do this to us? We love you. And never even understand it yourself. And yet people like you and me, living in the only one of 2 windows in mankind's history, we have to be begged sometimes to take advantage. The only thing that's ever helped people like you and me. It almost makes you wonder what the hell's going on. And I'm in a position that most of you aren't in. I see alcoholics die on a regular basis. And I see these people die on the sidewalk sometimes. And I think to myself, Jesus, I get letters from New Delhi, India saying I helped them with my tape and they saved their life. And I tour all over the world. People say, oh, you're so wonderful. How come I can't help this guy who I know and love and is laying in front of me dying? And then I got to remember, if people could be helped that easily, why did I slip in AA year after year after year after year with good sponsors and people being interested in me and taking an interest and people going to the wall for me? I think one of the great examples that after I was sober I think the week I got sober this time, Playhouse 90 did Days of Wine and Roses. And then 5 years later, they put it in a movie. I have the video, I have the old kinescope of the original production of that, because the guy who directed it is now in AA. And a guy, a sponsor in our group. But he was telling me one day, it's kind of funny, they're doing this Playhouse 90, and there's some AA meetings in there, if you remember that, Days of Wine and Roses. And there's some goof they're supposed to give them some technical information about it. Amy, yeah, thanks a lot, I'll try to work it in. And it gets all done, the guy gives him a copy of the big book, it's a souvenir, and signs it, and he says, oh, that's really great, thanks a lot, and that's the end of that. And 15 years later, 20 years later, he has to go to AA. And he hears all this talk, and he remembers that. That guy that signed my book, his name was Bill Wilson. It must be the same Bill Wilson. And he had to search his house to find that cherished first edition of the book with Bill Wilson's message in it. I tried to steal it from him. Son of a bitch is too smart. But anyway, in that, when I saw that when I was 5 years sober, the movie, there's a scene in there where the guy's sitting in a nut ward, and he's just come out of DTs, and the guy, AA guy played by Jack Klugman, comes to the door, says, pardon me, fella. He said, I'm from Alcoholics Anonymous. I've come to try to help you. The guy looks up, played by, I guess, Jack Lemmon. And when you see that, if you're sober a while, you just get tears in your eyes, because you think, boy, isn't that great? I know it's just going to happen. It took me a long time, years, to remember when that same thing happened to me in an insane ward, nut ward, and the guy came to my door and said, I'm from Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm here to help you. My instinctive reaction was, how can I use this simple son of a bitch to get out of here? There was no tears in my eyes. There's no tears, because I knew about AA. I always knew I wasn't an alcoholic. I always knew that my problem, I thought it might be at once, because I was sent to AA as a young man, but it didn't take me long to understand that I'm not an alcoholic. I have I used a phrase that I never realized for years and years is probably the most universally used phrase of anything I've ever heard among alcoholics all over the world. And it's just this. But my case is different. And really mean it. Be willing to bet your life on it. About 5 years ago, I was in Berlin to talk at a dinner. And the night before, it was just when the wall came down. The wall had been just coming down a few weeks. In fact, I went up to the wall and chipped off some rock off that wall personally. I took it home and gave it to my grandkids and said, remember, I love you more than your other grandfather. Got to do what you can in this world. But this meeting was held about 5 blocks from Checkpoint Charlie, where all the spies used to go in and out. Just still sitting there, and you just sat there. And you just know a couple of people from East Germany were at their first Western AA meeting, and people English speaking, and you just knew. You sit in this meeting, you're going to hear about freedom and what freedom means: the freedom from alcohol, and the freedom from tyranny, and the freedom from despotism. And you hear, you might as well stay in Santa Monica. You just hear some boob behind you say, but I don't think you really understand. I'm afraid my case is different. See you down to the coffee house, Hans. And it's that way all over the world. Last April, touring South Africa. Strange place, boy, I'll tell you. And I feel so sorry for him, because there's going to be some awful bloodshed. There was bloodshed going on. We were there, and this was a year in advance. But there are white meetings and colored meetings, which are mixed black and white blood, and then the native meetings. And the people in the native meetings sometimes go to the colored meetings, and the colored meetings go to the white meetings, and the white meetings, they'll speak at these other meetings, but they don't go to the other meetings. It's all very mishmash. But I spoke at a national convention there, which was the only meeting in the whole country, I think, where all 3 people from all 3 types of meetings sat down. And they talked about the same things exactly, different accents, but the same emotions that you hear talking around the pool out here. It's just amazing how similar we are, and yet we all know that makes us different. Came out of that meeting in fact, Natal, which is now under martial law. That's where the bloodshed is now. That's where the national meeting was, in Durban. And we came out of this at the University of Natal. on a Sunday afternoon, a bunch of us guys came out, and there were some rioters out there, big, mean-looking guys. And they had a sign that said, "We will wash our feet in your blood." And I reached within me to try to find an appropriate AA response. And all I could think of was, oh shit. How do I get out of here? And fortunately for us, that was a mixed meeting. A little black guy came running out and said, just told them we were in AA, and they said, "Oh, okay." They rolled up their sign and away they went, Thank you, Dr. Bob and Bill. But all over the world it's the same thing. Everybody knows their case is different. And I've heard that in a lot of places, in Berlin and Glasgow and Dublin and Belfast and Paris and London and Bristol and Sydney and Tahiti and Auckland, a lot of countries where I've been pleased to be able to go. And yet it sounds exotic, but it really isn't. It's a long plane trip to meet other people exactly like yourself. Because the case is different. Now I look back at my life, how could I slip in AA when I believe it so strongly now that the mere threat to any of existence makes me just want to cry, almost. I guess it's boredom. But to me, this has to be held sacrosanct. But people all over always got little movements to change this. And I saw something in the program tonight. I don't know if that's part of it. I hope not. Maybe. But it's like Minneapolis. There's a movement a couple of years ago to stop saying the Lord's Prayer. Because they thought it might offend Jewish members. There's a movement down south to stop saying the Lord's Prayer because it's too much of the Jewish influence. Just the opposite. There's a movement among some, I guess, feminists, I don't know who, in AA, to stop referring to God as Him. To not say God as we understand Him. Replace Him with the word God all the way through the book. God as we understand God. In fact, if you look on your program for tomorrow morning, there's a topic is God as you understand God. I hope that is not part of that movement. But I take great personal umbrage to people who want to change this. Because I'll tell you, this is the only thing that has ever worked. And because of your boredom, you may want to change it. But I want, if my grandkids or their kids got a place to go to, if they need help, I want them to go here and find out the same things that saved my bacon. I don't want to hear what your counselor or your therapist or some goddamn fool inner child tells you. I want to hear what's going on. Now to get back to my talk on love. But I'll tell you, I know that we all are different people, but I would fight anyone to the wall to keep from changing us. Because if it doesn't work, you may be sorry, but I may be dead. But I used to look back and used to think, why did I think I was so different? And the answer was always the same. Because I realized as a young man, like the other speakers you've heard here, that there was something different about my emotions. And I wasn't sure what it was, but I always felt a little bit different, it seemed to me. And I never could quite put a finger on it. When you talk years later, you can talk about these things, you make it sound you put it all together. But when you're going through it, it's just one baffling thing after another. And I suppose now looking back, if I wanted to put it succinctly, I would say there were probably 3 areas of my life that were most troublesome to me, although I didn't recognize the time because it's all just one thing after another. But one, it always seemed to me that people acted toward me as though I was not quite good enough. I was not convinced that I was not quite good enough, but they were somehow. They acted like I wasn't good enough. They didn't ever say anything, but it's just as though they saw something in me that wasn't enough, and they seemed to instinctively like each other better than they liked me. And they instinctively didn't invite me to all the things they invited. Just always felt like and it always made me feel so bad. And without being aware of it, I guess as a young man, I can look back now and see it very clearly, but then I never could, is that I set up a defense against this, a defense mechanism. And that is this. Keep people at a distance. Give them a little flash. Give them smart remarks, clever lines, one-liners, cute. Give them a little show. But then they'll never get close enough to know that I'm not good enough. And once in a while, when you let your defenses down and you get someone close, pretty soon they'll reject you and hurt you. Keep them at arm's length. It gets lonely, but at least you don't have to feel that bad. Another feeling I had much of my life is that I live with a lot of fear. Sometimes fear of things, but sometimes fear of people are going to find me out. People won't accept me. At my job, I won't get along. I won't get promoted right. People won't acknowledge the fact that I'm doing as much as I'm doing. Fear of a lot of things. This fear is an ongoing thing. An icy fist that clutches your gut till you don't even... I remember after I was sober, sometime I remember suddenly thinking, my God, I haven't been afraid all day. Because there's absence of pain, you don't notice it. And the other last thing that I seem to... The other great thing in my life is I always seem to be so sensitive to rejection. So sensitive to people's attitudes toward me. And I remember I've thought an awful lot. Why am I so damn sensitive? It's as though everybody gets a suit of armor and somebody left my armor off. I just like I'm raw meat. And I remember when I was sent to my first meeting many, many years ago. And I didn't think I should be there, and I didn't much like it. And they didn't much like to have me there because I was 22, and there wasn't anybody in that state with less than 40. There was less than 40 because 1949 there weren't anybody, young people in AA. And the second meeting I guess I went to, this guy came over to me like I would come over to a 5-year-old, I suppose, in the meeting today. He said, "Well, do you think you're an alcoholic?" I tried to be honest. I said, "No, I'm not. I don't think I am." He said, "Well, what the hell do you think's wrong with you?" I said, "As far as I know, I'm just too sensitive." And he laughed, just like you did. But I'll tell you, I never told anybody that again. Not for years and years. I never told anybody that again. I never was trying to be honest on that again. Because if they're going to laugh at me when I say I'm sensitive, then I had no idea that they were laughing with me. I thought they were laughing at me. So you keep the front up there too. And I went for years. I was sober some time before I ever confessed to anybody I was sensitive. And then it made no difference. And you might think about that when you're working with newcomers. When they say dumb things like I'm too sensitive or I'm not, funny things like that, remember not to laugh because they don't know that you're laughing with identification. They think they've tried to show themselves and they're different. And you may turn them off forever. So you've got to be very careful about that. But these kind of emotions, and a lot of other emotions, have always bothered me. And over the years, I can't live with them very well, so I went to psychoanalysis, spent a lot of time in psychoanalysis, a lot of money. I got to the root of these problems, found out why I had some of them, and they were interesting. I've always had the concept, I'm sure many people in this room have the concept, if I can just find out why I have these feelings, they'll go away. And I spent thousands of dollars in years of my life, and I'm sure some of the people in the room are doing it right now. If I can just find out why. Let me give you some good news and bad news. The good news is you can find out why in some cases. The bad news is it doesn't help. You find up feeling terrible and knowing why. Yeah. That's how you drift into the victim mode, which is the current, biggest, hottest therapeutic thing in America, the victim. Everybody's a damn victim. Everybody's got some new victimization. It's not... And I was a victim for a number of years. I'm not putting it down. I was a leading victim for a long time without even being aware of it. And in looking back, I used to think years ago, why did I like psychoanalysis? What is so good about psychoanalysis? Till the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen a group of therapies set up that do the same thing and make millions of dollars doing it. And there's a good reason for why victimization is so successful. The biggest and worst emotion I know of any people like me, and maybe like you, is guilt. I've had so much guilt in my life. Guilt of things I've done which were bad, but the things I should have done and didn't are even more painful. They're so amorphous, but they're painful. And you know what victimization does? Victimization removes guilt. It is the only therapy I've ever heard of that quickly removes guilt. And I'll tell you how it removes guilt. Because when it becomes their fault, it is no longer my fault. They did it to me. Their fault. And I'll tell you, it does rid you of guilt. And I'm not kidding you. There's only one little thing wrong with it. And that you discover that as you go along. There are no free lunches in the world. You get nothing free. You get no freedom from guilt-free. You got to pay little tabs. There are 3 little tabs for victimization. And the people who are into it are paying these tabs, although they're not always aware of it. The ones who finally get out of it can look back and see it. 1 tab. Whether you intend to or not, whether you plan to or even know what you're doing, as a human being, you must sustain and enhance resentment toward those who have done this to you. To the people who have ruined your life. To the people who have failed to nurture you. The people who have damaged you. That's a little tab you got to pay. When you go to these meetings of where these therapies are being sold, you'll find nobody smiling in those meetings. And nobody smiles coming out of those meetings because they enhance resentment. The second the second little price tag you got to pay, whether you intend to or not, you must accept the role that you have been made terminally different. There's no coming back. I never really understood that. I was in one of those meetings with someone one day and I heard their leader discussing it, a very well-known man. He said, you got to remember, we are like trees. When we were saplings, we were bent by unfeeling hands. And we didn't die, but as we matured, we grew into crooked things. And no matter what we do now, we cannot become straight trees again because you can't do that. So we have to learn to adjust to being crooked and doing what we can with it. So you must accept the fact you're terminally different, which is what AA does not say. And the third thing is, which is quite obvious if you look at these 2 things, the third tab you have to pay is intermittent but intense self-pity. Because it's I'll tell you, it sounds funny, but it isn't funny at all. Because just, why did they do it to me? I could have been something. I could have been a contender. I could have had a happy life. And these people screwed up my life and nobody ever really understood. And you say, well, that's no big deal. You know, it's kind of sad, but it isn't as bad as suicidal guilt. Maybe that isn't so bad. Maybe it isn't. But if you stay here long enough and read this blue book and other things like it, you'll discover there are the 3 most lethal, single most lethal things for people like you and me are resentment, self-pity, and feelings of difference. And why are they so lethal? Because they will justify every drink I take till I die from it. And it will never have been my fault. That's why it's lethal. That's why those kind of things give you an instant fix. It's almost like cocaine. It gives you an instant fix, but the price you pay is awful lethal. But I went to psychoanalysis and I read philosophy. I did a lot of things. But the one thing that helped me the most during all these years of my goofy emotions was something I paid hardly any attention to. And, it was alcohol. I hear people talk about sometimes in meetings, I discovered alcohol and in my life, I realized alcohol is the most important thing in my life. I never thought that at all. Alcohol was something I discovered along the way like everything else. You know, there's a book out that says, everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten. I never learned anything in kindergarten. I couldn't even learn to sleep on my rug. Where you learn things in your teens. That's where you learn things. You learn about your body changes. Men, I guess the same as women. And you learn about lust. And then you learn about love. And then you learn, if you're going to have any luck whatsoever, you've got to find a way to disguise lust as love. And you learn about your family isn't going to support you. And you learn about smoking. I learned about drinking on that ship. I learned about smoking on that ship in Pearl Harbor. I smoked and threw up and smoked and threw up. And one day I smoked and didn't throw up and I liked it. And I smoked 2.5 or 3 packs a day for the next 45 years. And I learned to drink and I learned to try to be a man. I didn't become a terrible, classy drunk. I was just a dumb little, pimply-faced, stupid little goof, run away from home on a merchant ship in Pearl Harbor. And I tried to learn to drink. I tried to do what men did. And somebody got drunk and somebody got sick. And later in the war, when I was old enough, I went in the Navy. At the end of the war, I was in the Naval Hospital up in Northern California, being sewed together. And they passed around, the war was over, so they passed around some tests. I've always been good on tests. Not doing anything, but tests I'm wonderful at. And I didn't know what it was, but they came back and said, "Oh, Clancy, we're so proud of you. You got the highest grade in the war." They gave me a high school equivalency diploma, which I thought, so what? But I thought about that many times since then. But it changed my life. I never paid any attention at the time. But if I hadn't gotten that, I had to go back to Wisconsin and start my junior year of high school. And I never would have done that in 1,000 years after the war. I was much too slick for that. But instead, I was able to go to college. I went to college with the first class of veterans after the war. And we all stood around the campus and tried to look like steely-eyed, sex-crazed killers. And one of our unemployment check would come on time for a change. And I got married in college. I went out in the world. I became a sports writer. I'd married this Catholic girl who had this unfortunate proclivity to have children on a continuing basis. So I had to get better jobs. I got advertising and public relations. And all these years, I drank. I didn't pay much attention to drinking. Drinking is the best friend. Alcohol is the best friend I've ever had. Sounds terrible to say that in a meeting, I suppose, if you're kind of new, but it's still, I resent when I hear people get up to the podium and say things like, "That damn alcohol was poison from the very first drink." It's like hearing somebody badmouth an old girlfriend of mine. You know. Just a minute, buddy. She may be a pig now, but she didn't used to be. You know. And I drank, and I'll tell you, when I drink, I'm much better. I'm a better father. I'm a better worker. I get along. I got jobs in public relations. And of myself, I'm kind of an introverted loner type. Just worst form of Norwegian Lutheran goof. And, you know, it's kind of hard to be a public relations man when you're on the wagon and you stand at cocktail parties and say things like, "Well, going to be a scorcher tomorrow, huh? See the woman in the gray dress? Looks like an elephant. Well, that's your wife, eh? Going to be a scorcher tomorrow." When I have a few drinks, it all changes. I become glib and hip. I move to the Algonquin round table in about 2 bounds. 10 minutes, I'm too hip for the room. That's true of everything. Alcohol, I love it. It adds, it's the only thing I've ever found that adds some sort of color to a gray tunnel called life. And I can look back now and see what alcohol does for people like me. I did at the time. It takes a person like me, for example, who's always felt like I'm not quite good enough, and at least for a few hours, I become more than enough. It takes a person like me who lives with fear, and for a few hours, mostly I become fearless. I fight cops. I do anything. Christ, I just jump off second-story balconies into the pool. Shit. It takes a person like me who's always fearful of rejection, and for a few hours I become the rejecter instead of the rejectee. God, that's wonderful if you're a wimp. You know, the best example of that I know is one I must have said it 1,000 times, but I'll say it one more time because I don't know a better way to put it. I'm sure it's happened to a lot of guys in this room, sitting in a bar late at night, having a few drinks, watching a veritable miracle take place in front of your eyes. Watching some old beast gradually become beautiful. I might sidle over to such an old queen at closing time. Imply there will be delights beyond her comprehension. If you'd like to join me in the old Chevy. Now, she would say, "No!" If I were sober, I suppose I'd hang myself. But I wouldn't be there asking the question if I were sober. When I've had a few drinks, I don't feel rejected. I feel sorry for her. Too bad, bitch. Don't come begging tomorrow. Alcohol enables me to function. The only problem I've ever had with alcohol is I sometimes drink too much. Or as I prefer to believe, I have many times been thoughtlessly overserved. Not my fault. And sat around and be pissed off every week. But it repressed me. I was like Prometheus, a Greek chained to a rock. But when I drank, the bonds broke and I was free. But when I became sober again, I was back to the rock. And that bothered. I could understand that. And I never could get the cop to understand it, you know. Oh, get in the car, you asshole. And so I was sent to my first AA meeting in 1949, as I said, a long time ago. And I didn't think I belonged there. I didn't think I belonged there then. And for the next few years, from time to time, I went to AA or sent to AA. I went to psychoanalysis. I did a lot of things. I had a lot of ambition. I wanted to be something. I became somewhat successful from time to time. I sometimes had to drink too much. I sometimes got in trouble. I got ups and downs and ups and downs. And the day finally came in my life that cannot happen to a person of my background and intelligence and ability. I found myself being physically thrown out of the Midnight Mission on Skid Row in Los Angeles. And the guy said, "Bum, stay out of here." And I tried to explain to him, I'm not a bum. 3 years ago, I was on the faculty of the University of Texas. Ads that I helped write, the old LC number ads for the board and company, were running that very week in Life and Time and Collier's and Saturday Evening Post. I've had my picture in the New York Times for achievement. How many people do you know in your circle of acquaintances who've had their picture in the New York Times for achievement? But it's hard to explain these things in midair, you know, as you soar. And when you have no front, I had my front teeth kicked out in the Phoenix jail about a month before that, so I wasn't hitting those consonants quite as cleanly. But my family was gone. My wife had taken the children finally in Dallas and went somewhere when I was often drunk. My parents had written me off, and I was their only child, so it had to be terrible for them because they tried very much to help me. I resented them because I thought they were among my high on my list of people who would ruin my life because they wanted me to do things that were good for me. And I stood in that street and dying. I'll tell you, if a guy would have come up to me and said, "Slim, you're just about dead. Can you admit you're an alcoholic?" And if my life depended on it, I'd have to say, "But I'm not. I wish I were. I wish I were an alcoholic. I wish my life were that simple. But there's something a lot deeper wrong with me than that. I don't know what it is, and maybe they did it to me. But whatever it is, stop and drink it. Don't help it." In fact, I thought about that later. I never, again, could not put so much, if you're kind of new, so much later you can see in perspective. You can't depend on how you see it now. You have to just listen to people guiding you, and one day you look back and see it. But I now know why I could never accept the role of alcoholic. Because, damn it, my problem is not really alcohol. It really isn't. It's a severe problem. But I have problems much worse and much more complex, and fears and guilts and despairs. And the difference between alcoholics and me, although I couldn't put my finger on it then, is this. Alcoholics are people whose problem is alcohol. When they get drunk, their emotions get out of whack and their lives get screwed up. They go to places like AA and they get sobered up. Their emotions return to level. Their lives get evened out and they feel good. And I look like them and I sometimes drink like them, but it's just exactly the opposite. When I try to stay sober too long, my emotions get screwed up and my life gets all painful. And I drink, not to drink, because I've discovered a couple drinks makes me feel the way they feel when they're sober. That's why I drink. When I don't drink, I get the way they get when they're drunk. I get pain and emotions and despair, inadequacies. And the only problem is sometimes I drink too much. And then well-meaning people say, oh, here's a fellow whose problem is alcohol. We'll send him to A and he'll be all right. And I learned to play the game and say, yeah, thank you, I'll go there and I'll be all right. Because it gets me out of the jam. But I know I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not an alcoholic. I wish I were. I'd pay anything if I were. And slight rain that morning outside of the midnight mission. And I walked 71 blocks out to the corner of Wilshire and Fairfax where there's a little AA club called the 6300 Club then, that I'd been asked to leave a week before for being in there drunk and fighting. And I walked in there I just hated to walk in there, but there was no place to go. I didn't want to be in jail again. And I looked terrible. I had no clothes, no front teeth, despair, no money, no nothing. Didn't know a soul within 2,000 miles as far as I knew. I couldn't think of a single person who would accept a collect phone call from me in America. I'm sure there were some people, but I don't know who they were. I know my parents wouldn't. And I had no idea that morning or thereafter for a long time, because it was a straight thing. I didn't want to be sober. I don't want to stay sober. Sobriety makes me try to commit suicide. The only time I ever stayed sober any length of time, I stayed sober in Texas for a very good reason. Because my son had died while I was in jail overnight. And it was nothing, my being in jail had nothing to do with it, but I carried that as my number one curse for a long time. If I would have been home, I would have somehow stopped it. And I took a little vow on his casket, secret little vow that I will not ever drink when we have little kids that need my help. And that summer I was in Texas and I was working on a bunch of little kids. I'd worked here alone and they came down. And it was loud and they were noisy and I loved them all. My wife was pleasant, but hot and sticky. I was working 2 jobs, working an advertising agency in the daytime and the university at night. It was hot and caught up and the money was behind from my last binge. And I couldn't stand it. I needed to drink so bad I could just scream when I couldn't drink because I'd taken a vow on my son's casket. What do you do now? One day they went to church and I just pulled the car in the garage and hooked a hose on the exhaust, put it inside the car and turned the motor and went to sleep and died. And a neighbor saw this and came over and pulled me out. I guess must have been dead maybe 30 seconds. He beat on my chest and breathed in my mouth. They rushed me to the hospital and worked on me and talked to me and determined that I was terribly emotionally wrong, something wrong with me. And they moved me to the psychiatric ward. They examined me for a while and determined I was a paranoid schizophrenic and committed me for an indefinite period up to the rest of my life in the Texas State Insane Asylum in Big Spring, Texas. That's how I get when I stay sober, folks. That's not much of a... I've often thought about that. I'd like to go back in Texas sometime and find that psychiatrist that made that diagnosis. I bet he's probably about 90 now. I could move him around pretty good. You quack! You ought to lose your license, calling me a dual personality. You ought to lose your license. If I could have got my personalities down to 2, I'd have made it. Jesus. My problem has always been this crowd that forms at the drop of a hat. What do you think we ought to do? I don't know. Let's get out of here. Maybe we should have. When I was new in AA, I used to hear people say things. I think maybe AA is not enough for me. I think I need group therapy. I've never needed group therapy. I just go for a ride alone in my car. That's what's so good about drinking. It reduces it to one voice. It may be a bad voice, but it's one voice. There's no decision. Why don't you quit your job and punch the son of a bitch in the face? Okay. Boom. But I hung around that club, and I didn't want to be sober. The way I got out of that nut house, incidentally, about 6 months later, 3 months later, they put in the first experimental alcoholic ward in the state of Texas, and they put it in that hospital. And by that time, I remembered I was around 5 or 6 years by that time, so I knew how to act like an alcoholic, and I got out as an alcoholic. And I never had another drink until I ran out of Thorazine. But I didn't want to stay sober, and that's why it's amazing that that was 35 and a half years ago, and I never even wanted to stay sober this time. I didn't have any intention, no goal of staying sober, and I stayed sober. And I'm sure every long-term slipper looks back at times like that and says, What was different this time? What changed this time? Why was it different? And the only thing I can think of is something I thought of 25 years ago, I suppose. Used to talk about it, and I've talked about it recently, but I used to talk about it a lot. The thing that somehow or other I was able to, without being aware of it, utilize my terrible desperation to help me. Now that sounds a little strange, but terrible desperation is the thing, all of us know that feeling, because that's the thing that makes you get drunk when you're sober. The feeling of terrible desperation. Now how could that help you? What helps you is that, I guess, if you can, without even being aware of it sometimes, if you're so out of it, you will allow someone to steer that desperation, and they can use that same desperation to make you take actions that you would never take under any other motivation. It's like coming about crossing the plane from Los Angeles the other day. I was thinking about that. Planes, jets push that plane 550 miles an hour, and they land at Honolulu, and you think, I hope this guy's got brakes. But you don't need brakes. You have no brakes on those planes to speak of, because they just reverse the thrust of the jets. The same jets that push you this way stop you. And much the same way, this pain that for people like you and me, if I can surrender it, that's they talk about surrender, allowing someone to superimpose their direction over my feelings. And that's almost impossible, because I don't know of anybody like me who, when your back's in the corner like a cornered rat, your mind says, I know they mean well, I know they want to help me, but they can't possibly know as much about me as I know. They can't possibly know the things I've tried, the various emotions. But I hung around that club, and I got a sponsor somehow or other. In order to get, I was living in the back seat of an abandoned car in the A Club parking lot, and I was the kind of guy around that club that old timers didn't want their people they sponsored to monkey with. Stay away from that goddamn Clancy. He'll get you drunk right along with him. Yeah. Probably I would do the same thing if I had the same guy, if I were the sponsor today. And I did little things, and I was in desperation and pain, and I had no place to go. And of course you might think, well, sure, it's easy. If you're on Skid Row, you got no front teeth, you lost everything. But that is not a thing that deals with coming off Skid Row. Over the years, I've sponsored a lot of people, and some kind of exotic. They put the flag on the moon, and movie directors, and movie stars, and psychiatrists, and industrialists, and none of those people were ever thrown out of the Midnight Mission. None of them have ever been to Skid Row. What we have in common, we all came here with that terrible feeling of desperation and the knowledge we were not really alcoholics, that our emotions were different. And that's what's got to be overcome. And you can't overcome it. You don't have time to overcome it before you have to do something about it. So I guess that's why surrender is such a terribly important tool here, why we keep preaching it. Because we have to ask people to do things before they believe in them, when they still know their case is different, and knowing those actions can't help. But the most important, but anyway, I stayed sober little by little, and I finally had some very close calls, There's an interesting analogy to me. About 1910, these early planes in the early 1900s, these old planes, these guys go up there playing, and all they had was a stick. And the one thing that was lethal to them was a tailspin. If they get the tailspin, you're dead. They'd dig them out of the ground, trying to pull that baby back, to try to pull its nose up, and they never could. And one day, a guy named Lieutenant Selfridge was up at some tremendous height, like 1,100 feet, and he got into a tailspin, and he tried to pull it out, and he couldn't, and it was just delaying his death. So he thought, I'd rather die than be like this. So he pushed it forward, and that day they discovered how to pull a plane out of a tailspin. You go out the other way. And that's the same way they do it today. If a big jet plane, God forbid you get in a tailspin, they give it rudder and come out this way. But oddly enough, there were still a few pilots who died after that, even though they had a technique, because they knew all about it till they got in tailspin. But when they got in the tailspin, there's no time for theory. I got to pull this son of a bitch out. And that's just the way it is for people like me, and I presume like most of you in AA. All of us sit around and talk about emotions knowledgeably in meetings, other people's problems, pleasant smiles. Oh yes, you can do that. If you just throw them till you get in the tailspin yourself, and then I haven't got time to discuss this, baby. I got to pull this out. And somehow, if you're in an activist group, eventually you'll push it forward. But boy, I'll tell you, if you've been sober a long time, you've done it a few times. I pushed that stick forward 3 or 4 times, where when I came out, I had grass stains on the top of my head. Boy, just because it deals with deep visceral emotions. But eventually I stayed sober. I eventually got jobs, held jobs, not right away, but after a while. Terrible jobs, then good jobs, and got into radio and television when I was 7 years sober. Another guy and I created the #1 hard rock station in the world, something called Boss Radio. I went downtown doing public relations with oil companies, and I was marketing director in Beverly Hills. And I was 5 years sober, the same wife and all those children. Moved to California from Texas, and 9 months and 10 seconds later, another Catholic hit the street. To show the ecton. If you are Catholic, let me tell you something that may be of interest to you. I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Lutheran. But it brought tears to my wife's eyes because she's a Catholic. My son he's a computer wizard of some sort. He's been sent over to straighten out the Israeli national computer system somehow. He tries to tell me what it is. I just, leave me alone. I don't understand that. But he called up his mother on Good Friday. He said, "Mother, I want you to know that today I visited the original Stations of the Cross in Jerusalem on Good Friday. I thought you'd be happy." She, "That's so beautiful, Clancy." I took some money out of her purse and left. But anyway, so they're all grown up and everything is fine. But the thing I want to just make 5 minutes to talk. I know we want to keep us waiting too long, but I want to talk just a little bit more to these new people. The most important thing I've said tonight, or I've said before I sit down, I said a long time ago, and nobody paid any attention. I said, "My name is Clancy I, and I'm an alcoholic." And you might wonder, when the hell did I become an alcoholic? I wasn't an alcoholic when I drank. I wasn't an alcoholic when I got sober. I haven't become an alcoholic since. And the reason I said that is because somewhere along here I was lucky enough to fall into the hands of activists who demanded actions of me, who demanded that I act better than I feel or believed. And I thought that made me a hypocrite. What that made me was a recovering alcoholic. And what I eventually survived long enough to discover is the most important single thing I've ever discovered, or I will ever discover, I believe. I discovered that it is true, my problem really wasn't alcohol. If my problem is alcohol, I'm not an alcoholic. How do you like that? If I'm an alcoholic, my problem is not alcohol. Now, doesn't that sound upside down and crazy, like some videotape from some guru? But I'm convinced that's the message of AA, the message of this book, the message of these meetings. I'm sure I'm one of the few people in this room who ever sat and talked to Bill Wilson about it at length. And that's what he felt, at least in his office circa 1963. But you say, of course the problem is alcohol. It's got to be. I can disprove that in one sentence. If alcohol is the problem, detoxes turn out recovered people. And they don't. Hospitals, treatment centers, jails, they turn out people who are physically sober with varying amounts of information about what may be wrong with them. But I'll guarantee you, if they be an alcoholic of our type, unless something dramatic happens after that, sooner or later they must eventually always drink or sedate. Well, if it isn't alcohol, what the hell is it? Is it like one of these scams where you send in more money and maybe get a video and get some more books and all this crap? Nope. You already know what's wrong with you, but you just don't know it because you've heard the phrase again and again. The problem here is not alcohol. It is something called alcoholism. You say, well, it's the same thing. Alcoholism, same thing. Not the same thing. Significantly different. If you be like me, I'll guarantee you the day will come when your life and sanity will demand on remembering the difference. And there's a lot of differences, but put it in one sentence. Again, because we're running a little late. An alcohol problem is overcome by stopping drinking and cleaning up your act. in this strange, destructive, eroding, mentally consuming, eventually fatal thing called alcoholism, you will discover sooner or later, if you haven't discovered it yet, that stopping drinking and cleaning up your act has no long-term effect on your life other than to gradually make it so painful you can't stand it. The thing that makes alcoholism a fatal disease is that the pain of sobriety will always get worse than the remembered relief of drinking. But even that doesn't make you an alcoholic. Something else must be present that you aren't even aware of. You must be one of the 6 or 7% of people in every generation going back 4,000 years who have an unnatural reaction to alcohol. And the funny thing about it, not very humorous, no one ever knows it's an unnatural reaction because you have nothing to compare it against. So what is this unnatural reaction? Makes you stay drunk all the time? Nah, that's podium talk. Makes you act crazy? Some people do, some people don't. Can't handle it? Nah. Alcoholics handle alcohol better than social drinkers in any kind of a test. The unnatural reaction is one I never would have guessed about myself in 10,000 years. Maybe you wouldn't have either. Oh, isn't that sad? Let me tell you what happened to me in that nut house, kid. They gave me shock treatments. Now I've lost my place and I have to start over. My name is Clancy I, and I'm an alcoholic. The unnatural reaction, you know what it is? The unnatural reaction, it must have the power to almost instantly make everything all right. That's all. It must, you could call it technically, it must have the power to almost instantly alter my perception of reality, to change my relationship to my environment, to do all sorts of things. But as far as you and I are concerned, to make everything all right. It doesn't do that for most people. That's why they don't drink. It's not a moral superiority. As Abraham Lincoln said, I don't have the thirst. Why don't I have the thirst? Because it doesn't do that for me. For them it goes blah, blah, blah. For me it goes and if it does that for you, you got the best thing going that you'll ever have. It's better than narcotics, any kind of narcotics. I never took narcotics, but I've been working with addicts for over 25 years. I know a little bit about addiction. I know about heroin, about the great euphoria, the wonderfulness of euphoria of heroin. But pretty soon you can't get back to it. Heroin addicts always die of overdoses because they're trying to get back to some place they can't get back to. Cocaine gets you momentary omnipotence, just a fair and everything just perfect. But it's like all other speed drugs, pretty soon the side effects kick in, the paranoia, the terrible discomfort, the addiction, the body starts to go, and you can't make it. But alcohol doesn't do that if you're an alcoholic, at least not for a long time. It puts you right where you are in a different world. And it's just wonderful, except for one thing. If it does that for you, it little by little erodes your ability, whatever abilities you have to deal with reality anyway. Because you don't have to deal with it anymore, because you can escape it. And one day drinking gets to be a problem. So then you got to get sober. Then you discover that's really painful. So then you got to drink. And then you got to get sober. And then you got to drink. And then you got to get sober. And that phenomenon is called alcoholism. And today in America, where there's more sobriety than there's ever been any place in the history of the world, there's more sobriety in this room than there was in the world in 1941. In America today, it is estimated over 95% of alcoholics still die drunk. And I'm sure a number of people in this room are going to die drunk. Maybe me, maybe you. My sponsor told me that once, and I laughed at him till he died drunk some years later, and I believed him then. Because it isn't so much on what you might say tonight, it's based on what they call a maintenance of a spiritual condition somehow. But I'm sure these people who died drunk all die saying the same thing, I believe. But I'm not really an alcoholic. You don't understand. My problems come when I'm sober. They're real. I just drink to get some relief. And I got a little carried away with it and got overboard, but it wasn't alcohol. And they don't realize they've just defined the disease of alcoholism. They'll never know. The reason I say this, if you're not new, you're not here to get sober. Being sober is not the goal of AA. Being sober is the goal of treatment centers, perhaps, and detoxes. Being sober is the entrance to Alcoholics Anonymous. And you enter, and you stay here, and you come to discover the natural state of sober alcoholics is growing anxiety and depression, or as our book says, restlessness and discontent. And that is when you start AA. You then must surrender here somehow and allow someone, hopefully a sponsor, who can see through you, to superimpose actions over your thinking, and you do things that you don't believe in until you get better. It's the opposite of every therapy in the world. Every therapy says, you come to us, we will change your thinking, and eventually your actions will get better. AA says, you come to us, and we'll change your actions, and eventually your thinking will get better. That's why it is so essential that we keep the actions correct, even to the point of reading chapter 5. That we do the things, not what we can get away with tonight with our mind, but to do the things that work. Because if we don't have any respect in the meeting, we sure as hell ain't going to have any respect for AA outside of the meeting, I'll tell you that. And we have to depend on it. And little by little you come to realize you're an alcoholic. And you take these actions and things get better. Because in the last analysis, you may come to discover, I'm sure you're like me, when I was new, you might sit there and think, Jesus, how long do you have to keep doing this guy? He's been dry for 35 years. He's about to burst into flame. I don't do it because I'm not here to get drier. If you're sober 2 weeks, you're as sober as you're ever going to be as long as you live. Purpose of AA is not to do that. Purpose of AA is not to make you wonderful. You get the impression sometimes from speakers that they've risen above human beings. Take a good look at them because they might not be around long. The purpose of AA, it seems to me, is to do exactly suffer the little children to come unto me. No, I'm in my new grandfatherly phase now. Here's $1, kid. Yeah. The purpose of AA, as far as I can tell you, is this. It is to very slowly do what alcohol does fast. I don't know a better way to put it. In my life, I watched alcohol little by little take a person who's never enough, and most of the time today I'm enough. Not all the time, because it used to bother me until I discovered no human being feels like they're enough all the time. That's part of being a human being. But you can increase the ratio. It takes a person like me who's lived with fear all my life. And today, much of the time, I'm fearless. I go down alleys on Skid Row today that the police are afraid to go down in their cars with drawn guns. And I'm down there with a smile in my chatter, pulling guys out. But on the other hand, I'm a human being. When I sit at home at night with my wife and we hear frightening noises in the garage or in the house, in the backyard, I send her to see what it is. It may be a boogeyman. And everyone knows that boogeymen respond better to Al-Anons than AAs, you know. Can you just see the boogeyman turning just when he sees that cold smile coming out of the dark? I release you. Takes a person like me who has always lived with rejection and hurt feelings, and most of the time I don't have them. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I feel, almost briefly, I feel as bad as I ever felt. But I know what it is, and I don't have to live with it. Because that's part of being a human being. I don't want to mistake every human emotion as some sort of an alcoholic punishment. You'll have all the emotions you ever had, except they'll be a little modified not so often. That's all. You know what they are. Because I believe that Alcoholics Anonymous is today what it has always been. And I want you to listen to this. If you ignore everything else, I'll tell you what it is. It is not this book. It's not meetings. It is not love. It's not spirituality. These things are all very nice adjuncts, very nice backups to AA. But Alcoholics Anonymous is the same thing in April in Kona Coast as it was on June 10th, 1935 in Akron, Ohio. It is one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic to help him reduce his feelings of difference at least enough so that he will begin to take actions he does not yet believe in. And that's what everything else is secondary to it. That's why they formed Narcotics Anonymous. So people who are not alcoholic but who have narcotics problems can find people they identify with. Not just information, but people identify. That's why Gamblers Anonymous was formed by members of AA. That's why Overeaters Anonymous was formed by members of AA. That's why all these things were formed by members of AA. When we say you have to be an alcoholic to be in AA, we're not being mean. But unless you're an alcoholic, I can't identify with you if you're talking. I got to hear people who hit me in the gut, not in the mind. Christ, I've listened to the most intellectual people in the world and been able to shut them off. Identification. It's more than a coincidence. The only two successful organizations in the world that ever dealt with alcoholics were the only two organizations that had drunkards helping drunkards, alcoholics helping alcoholics, not good people helping bad people, one helping another. The last thing I want to say is there's been a lot of talk about the Pacific Group this week by these other speakers. And the Pacific Group, in a sense, 30 years ago, I wanted to be secretary of a meeting. And so I got a guy to nominate me to be secretary at Brentwood. And my nomination died for a lack of a second. I could see there was not a groundswell for me to become secretary anymore. And someone said, there's a little Tuesday night at the Ohio Street's open, go over there. I said, okay. I got over there and claimed it and wrote a little format. And I got 8 or 9 tired followers I had, and we set up the Pacific Group. Got a speaker. The first meeting, there were 9 of us, 10 of us with the speaker. Next week we had about 12 or 13 there. Next week we had about 18 or 19. I guess I offended some people in my announcements. We went back to 9 the next week. But little by little, at the end of a year, we must have had the intelligence yet to keep this going. So I'll just sacrifice myself, and I won't have the election. I just won't even mention it. I'll just be secretary some more. So I was secretary for another year. And we pulled up maybe 60, 70 people. God, it's tremendous. And I thought, well, they're so close to self-determination, but it's like Rhodesia. They're not quite ready. So I'll keep on going just a while longer. And after about 2 months, some boob came up to me one night. Are we ever going to have an election around here? And this was a man whose life I'd saved. I said, what? Don't you think I'm doing a good job? He says, yeah, but people in other groups say we never have an election. If we had an election, we could elect you then, and then nobody could say anything. I said, good idea, Jimmy. So I had the election, and they swept me out of office. For Christ's sake. Felt like Winston Churchill at the end of World War II. But I'll tell you what a good job I had of setting that meeting up. Even though I left, the membership really took off after that. And now it's about 1,000 people every Wednesday night. Biggest meeting in the world. Most successful, lively. Many of you have been there. It's up and good speakers. And we send tapes all over the world. People order tapes from all over the world on a weekly basis. Just good meeting. And I sit there every week. So I've been in my home group for 30 years. And I'm the founder. They don't welcome my advice very much. But I sit there in the middle and I give little signals. Nobody pays any attention, but it cheers me up. At the end of the meeting, when they line up in the back to thank the speaker, I try to stand around back there and look like a founder. I'm fairly well dressed because I've still have my work clothes on. And people bring newcomers up and they say, this is Clancy I. He founded this group. He flies all over the world and speaks to people. He's very famous, been sober a long time. I give them my smile and I say, welcome. I hope you brought your problems tonight. Many folks leave them here. Unctuous is the word, I believe. Once in a great while, some boob will come up who doesn't know who I am. And you'll say something like, hey, buddy, can you give me a ride back over to the VA psycho ward? And the lesson I want to tell you about AA is this. Number one lesson. thing I learned when I was new, and it holds just as true now. I can look right into his wretched little sick eyes and think whatever I want at him. I can look right in his eyes and think, what? Give you a ride to the VA psych ward? There are 1,000 people in this room who need action. A bunch of dilettantes, for Christ's sake, practically. And one who is given all forever. Get one of these people to give you a ride, for Christ's sake. You'll do them good. I'm not just some guy standing back here looking like $1 million. I'm Clancy I from up in the sky. The nice thing about AA is this. You can think that as long as you say, okay. And the magic of AA is always the same. After I drop that puke off at the VA, I drive home and my head says, oh, Clancy, there's no end to your goodness. So I think that's the test. I've had many wonderful things that happen to me in AA. I've come to believe in a loving God that I never thought I could believe in. I came to reconcile with my father and mother and lived many years of happiness because of amends I made to overcome my resentments towards them. A lot of things. But the number one thing is this, that has served me in the best stead of everything in the world. It has allowed me to take actions that enable me to believe that I belong right where I stand. Wherever I may be standing, I belong there. I deserve to be there. I'm not better than anyone else. I'm not worse than anyone else. I'm not above them. I'm not below them. For the first time, most of the time, I'm where I belong, in Alcoholics Anonymous, with people like me doing the same things and going in the same direction. If you're new tonight, or weak and heavy laden as sometimes people become, you must keep taking the actions. Don't think how you feel. Don't examine how it all looks. Take the action. Take the action. You'll be glad you did. Thank you.